Welcome to part 2. Here we will be delving into the remainder of the questions, as well as the remainder of the Star Wars questions that were submitted. A few of them trickled into the first half, but the vast majority of the Star Wars questions will be answered here and now, and so without further preamble, let's begin. Favorite Force powers? Um, I'm going to be addressing the subject of force powers a lot. I've sort of skimmed through the Star Wars questions here. I had to kind of organize my thoughts for some of these. Some of these are not simple questions. Some of them will have very involved answers. So I'm going to address my thoughts on the Force and various powers later on. But in terms of powers that I enjoy thinking about, not necessarily ones that I would want to have or need to have if I lived in the Star Wars universe as a Jedi, I'll just toss out a few that interest me. Battle meditation, as made famous by figures like Bastila Shan, Oppo Rancisis, etc. Shatterpoint, as made famous by figures like Mace Windu. Precognition, psychometry, which is an ability you can view within Quinlan Voss's storyline. Enhanced reflexes, telekinesis, and the healing properties of the Force. Those are the ones that they're my favorite concepts. Let's put it that way. All right, number 2, favorite lightsaber forms. Okay, so for those who don't know, there are 7 forms of lightsaber combat. Each was created for a specific purpose. I don't think that any one form is the ultimate form. There are 2 forms that I do think have inherent weaknesses, so I think that they are. I'm not saying that they're the worst of the 7, but they are the. I can understand how they would get the reputation that they have. But for me, Makashi, which is Form 2, and Vapad, which is Mace Windu's variant of the 7th form, they're my favorites as concepts. They're not the 2 I would master if given the choice, but as ideas in terms of how, like the reason why they were developed, what they allow a user to do, they're my favorite concepts. They're the ones that fascinate me the most, not the ones I think are the most worthy of study. Number 3. Name the 3 characters you'd most want to meet from Knights of the Old Republic. Jolie Bindo, because I think he's just a really amazing individual, not just as a teacher per se, but just I think he's a fine storyteller, and he has the right sort of I like I enjoy the sentiment of what he has to say, what he feels he has to say, the stories that he shares. So Jolie Bindo, I'd like to meet with him. Cartho Nassi, because he's a non-Force user who I respect just as much as any Jedi. And depending on the circumstances, HK-47. I wouldn't want him on a mission. I wouldn't want him trying to seek me out, because chances are I wouldn't be coming back. But, to sit and have a conversation, to ask him a few questions, I think I'd like to talk to HK-47. Your top 10 favorite or top 10 Knights of the Old Republic characters can be from either game. Okay, so meaning the original Knights of the Old Republic duology, not the Star Wars The Old Republic. From the first 2 games, I've had to pick 10 characters, and I'm not going to count player characters like Revan or the Exile. I would say all the ones I just mentioned, Jolie Bindo, Cartho Nassi, HK-47, but also Bastila Shan, Candrace Ordo, Darth Malak, Kreia, Handmaiden Juhani, and Darth Sion. I think that was 10. There are some characters whose personalities I enjoy more than people like Handmaiden, Kreia, or Sion, for example. But in terms of the roles that these figures play, especially because when I play Knights of the Old Republic 2, I play as male, so I have the Handmaiden with me. In terms of how these figures play into the story, and the way that their personal quests are developed or completed, they just leave me with the most satisfaction. So I think that they're as worthy as the main characters, like your main villain, like Darth Malak or Bastila Shan, who's as much a part of the main story as the player character is. Next question. Um, your three favorite minor characters from both games. Okay, I'm gonna I'm gonna modify this one. I'm gonna give you my five favorite minor characters from both games, simply because, which is hard enough because there's a bunch from either game that I'd like to talk about, and I just can't if I have to narrow it down this much. So I don't want to leave, um, I want to leave as few people in the dark as possible. When I mentioned the characters that I just mentioned, like Jolie or HK-47 or Handmaiden, you know, Candrass. These are figures who, within the first game anyway, Candrass, because Candrass plays a much more pivotal role in the second game, I think. By and large, the characters I mentioned, they're not necessarily important or the most important characters, but they're the ones that I think have the most to share, the most to offer to the story. They're my favorite characters as a whole, even though there are others who are just as interesting, just as worthy of being talked about, though not as important or memorable for various reasons. And so that's what put those figures over the edge. But in terms of the minor characters from either game, they're really what makes the Knights of the Old Republic duology as rich as it is to me. The random people you encounter, the people who really don't affect the story at all, but affect your experience. They're the ones that make the games worth replaying to me. Otherwise, they would just be fine stories that I would carry with me. But getting to interact with these people that I'm about to mention, they're what really adds to not the lore, because the story is enhanced, by the lore. They really enhance the player experience. My five favorite minor characters from the original are Sharina Fizark, Zelka Forn, Ajinta Paul, the assassin droid in the Tomb of Mark Aragnos on Korriban, and Jarok. I'm sure I didn't pronounce all of these correctly, but Sharina Fizark was she's a woman on Tatooine whose husband was killed, and I always want to help her in any way that I can. I would feel just heartless not being able to help improve her situation. And she's such a minor character that you really don't even have to talk to at all. But she feels real, and it's really a testament to the level of voice acting, to the way that even the most minor characters were treated, that I can remember her as fondly as some of my favorite party members. Then we have Zelka Forn, who was a doctor on Terrace, who did what he could to ease the passing of the Republic troopers who crash landed on the planet in the midst of a Sith occupation imposed by Darth Malak's forces. Um, he also develops a cure for the Rakghoul disease with your help and takes it to the Undercity to deploy it. And I just think that that's really honorable and well worth remembering. Then Ajunta Paul is a spirit of one of the most ancient Dark Lords of the Sith, whom you can actually redeem and turn back to the light. I think personally that the big theme of the original Knights of the Old Republic is redemption. It's something that colors the tale of Revan, the tale of Bastila, to some extent the Jedi themselves, informed by characters like Jolee Bindo and Juhani. And it's not exclusive to the Jedi though. Candrass, and what he was involved in, what he takes pride in, being a Mandalorian, his Mandalorian heritage. It doesn't. He's a dark individual, but he's not an evil individual, and he proves that just by his actions, by what he says, by his sentiment. Cartho Nassi and his personal vendetta with Saul Kareth. I mean, it all. It's very much about a galaxy that fractures itself and how the individuals pick up the pieces. That's something that was much more prevalent in the second game, I think, because the theme there was of a wounded galaxy. But in the first game, I think you get to see the redemption. You get to be a part of it. You get to be redeemed yourself. Whereas in the second game, you basically spend the entire game just beginning to realize how broken, or just beginning to understand how messed up everything is. And then you leave the galaxy in a state where they're ready to begin healing, but you don't actually get to see much of the healing yourself. And getting back to my point with Ajunta Paul, He's a spirit of one of the most ancient Dark Lords, and the fact that you can redeem him, I mean, it's just it just shows no matter how far you fall, you can still be welcomed back into the light, and I think that's a really wonderful notion. The assassin droid was an interesting concept. How can you not respect a droid who was designed to kill but is now seeking an alternate path because he's begun to appreciate life? It's just an interesting situation concept. And Jarok, or however you say the name, he was a Wookiee on Kashyyyk. And he was accused of and actually guilty of murdering one of his fellows, a Wookiee hero named Rorwar, if I remember correctly. However, not everything was as it was cracked up to be. Rorwar had been dealing with slavers from the unscrupulous Zerka Corporation. This quest was very satisfying to me, even if it has a bit of a bittersweet, or was a bit of a bittersweet experience. And it really gave great insight into the culture of the Wookiees. And so I just find him especially sympathetic and memorable. My five favorite minor characters from Knights of the Old Republic 2 are probably going to have to be Braylor, Azkul, Zez Kayel, Goto, or G0T0, however you say it, and Karana. Braylor was a Mandalorian who felt honored by his defeat at the Exile's hands. I liked that. He, like the Exile herself, was also worthy of respect and not blinded by arrogance. Azkul, he was just a cool villain on Dantooine, mostly because of his voice, I have to admit. Which is the same voice actor, I believe, who played Darth Malgus in The Old Republic later on. Zez Kayel was the only council member, or council master in that game, who I actually would have liked to have spared from Krea's wrath if given the opportunity. I plan on talking about this more in a future video, but he was actually willing to concede to the mistakes he and the others, his colleagues on the council, had made in the handling of the Mandalorian Wars. And I was sorry to see him go, even though he was ultimately culpable and just as much a part of what happened in the story as the other masters. And so he was a deeply flawed but also deeply introspective Jedi, who I respect. I realized that Goto was technically a party member and so is thus probably technically a main character. But I consider his role much more that of a supporting character. Having said that, I enjoy not just the concept of what he or it essentially is, but the chain of circumstances that led to him becoming what he was, or what he is. It is. And Karana was a very minor character. She was a woman who was dumped off on Nar Shaddaa along with her family. And I felt really bad for her and her situation. You know, it's very fun to fantasize and think about what it would be like to live your life in the Star Wars galaxy. But this is sort of the dark side of that, or the other side of the the flip side of the coin here. When you think, what would it be like to have somebody take total advantage of you and dump you off in a sector of space where you know nobody, where you have no means at all, and to just be stuck there? What an awful situation. And to be so potentially far away from home, as to be on another world, stranded on a world. It just is such a grim idea, and I would just feel totally heartless if I didn't help her. And of course, because of the nature of the game, you can either take total advantage of her if you're heartless, or you can help her and her family get off the planet. And it's satisfying to me to know that in a galaxy as screwed up and grim and wrong as it is in this game, I can bring about some measure of meaningful healing to the general populace and see that reflected in the betterment of actual characters' lives. So yeah, those are my favorite minor characters from both games. There are many, many more I could mention. There are many situations or side quests and circumstances I would like to mention. But these are the ones that, for now, that I would have to name my favorite people. Moving on. Your favorite Star Wars game after the original Knights of the Old Republic? Um, Probably a close. It's probably technically Knights of the Old Republic 2, all things considered. But to branch away from Knights of the Old Republic completely, I would say it's probably a tie between Battlefront 2 and Jedi Knight Jedi Academy. Alright, next question. Oh boy, this is a downer. Jolie versus Kreia. Look, this is a complicated issue, and because I have so many questions, suffice it to say that I do think Jolie is a better swordsman. I have numerous reasons to substantiate that claim. Anybody is free to disagree, but he has the definite physical advantage, and because he has both of his hands, and I think that he would win in a straight up lightsaber duel. But given how Kreia was able to deal with the Masters on Dantooine, I feel I have no choice but to award her the edge in terms of force power. If she uses that technique, I think Jolie's a goner. If she doesn't, then I think he could overtake her in a straight-up lightsaber fight. But I see no reason why she wouldn't. I mean, there's no reason to assume she wouldn't use the technique if forced to. So I'm going to give Kreia the nod. That said, I like Jolie a lot more. He's an infinitely preferable character to me. Alright, moving on. How powerful do you think Darth Bandon is relative to the other notable Jedi or Dark Jedi and Sith of both games? I think that Darth Bandon was probably rather like Asajj Ventress. We have to remember that he was the apprentice studying at the under the current Dark Lord of the Sith, that being Malak, of course. Bastila Shan as well. I view her as similar to Asajj Ventress in terms of combative ability, not in terms of potential. I think Bastila's potential outstrips Asajj's by some margin. Both were prospective apprentices of Darth Malak, meaning Bastila and Bandon. And given that Bastila claimed after her fall to the dark side to be more powerful than all but the greatest of the Jedi Masters at the time, I think of her as a deadly combatant with combat skills on par with that of Asajj Ventress, who similarly could take on and defeat certain council members in her own time. It's just that Bastila had a proclivity with force powers of a much more advanced nature than Asajj ever displayed, and thus a greater potential for growth, in my view. So I would view Bandon in a similar fashion, just much more inhibited or limited. Probably could only be bested by the best of the Jedi at that time. So less powerful than Bastila and also slightly less impressive than Ventress in an overall sense, but still notably skilled, notably impressive. One of the best of his era. The question goes, same question for Uthar and Euthura of Korriban. How do you think they stack up against the rest, including their Jedi equivalents? I consider Uthar to be a direct counterpart to the Council Masters. His familiarity with the dark side and his devotion to the Sith ideals and teachings and his considerable wisdom are all noteworthy. If you actually listen to what he says, he doesn't do a whole lot of stupid, evil rants. Like, he actually does understand the Sith philosophy. Flawed as I personally believe the Sith teachings inherently are, he understands them. He's no fool. The double-bladed lightsaber, which was his favorite weapon, also points to an adept level of training in lightsaber combat, as the weapon is reputed to be more dangerous and difficult to master than the single blade. So he didn't take his training lightly. He was clearly dedicated. Also, the pride he showed in his pupils and his apparent eagerness to teach and test them, and to see them succeed despite the backstabbing nature of the Sith, and his desire to cling on to his own post when challenged for mastery. These things prove that he was a proper Sith Lord, despite the short amount of time in which he operated. Remember, I don't discount this fact at all. Revan and Malak led the rediscovery of Korriban after their return from the unknown regions. This fledgling Sith Empire was still entrenching its roots and finding itself, so to speak. That's why you saw so many people out in the Valley of the Dark Lords excavating. They were rediscovering their heritage. For Uthar to have been... for him to have acted decisively enough to grab power from his own master, the insane hermit, Jorak Ulm, and to drive the future of the Sith onward, to be responsible for the training of the majority of Malak's Sith forces, that places a lot of burden on his shoulders. The duty would not have been entrusted to him if he were not capable. So I view him very much as a Council Master counterpart, much like Cordis, who existed thousands of years later and was at the academy when Darth Bane came to study. You know, he's responsible for the training of the beings that swell the ranks of the Sith, of the Sith Masters, and that's nothing to thumb your nose at. Euthura, on the other hand, was not as powerful in my estimation, though she was smarter. She was just as, if not more cunning than her master, but the fact that she wanted him poisoned before initiating her own bid for mastery, that points to a level of insecurity on her part regarding her chances. So, while I see Uthar as an equal to the Council Masters, I doubt whether Euthura had reached that level yet. Okay, next question. If you could live anywhere in the Star Wars galaxy and in any era, where and when would that be? Ever since playing Knights of the Old Republic, I've been very enamored with the concept of residing on Dantooine during that same era, the Old Republic era, and preferably long before the Sith forces bombarded it on Malak's orders. You know, it's a frontier world with a lot of action and adventure, but it's also a haven for Jedi and a place for anyone, Jedi or not, to find a new start and to feel a connection with nature and sort of be at peace. Next question. Alright, so upon mastering the standard lightsaber, you have to choose between either the double-bladed lightsaber or saber staff, or dual sabers. If I could only choose one or the other, or if I had to choose one or the other, rather, I would choose dual sabers. The option of bringing a second blade into play is appealing to me, and not as limiting as a saber staff can be under certain circumstances. It has a number of intrinsic flaws, and the drawback of being not able to pull off effective power attacks using your dual sabers would be remedied by simply putting the second blade away when not necessary, and simply using a two-handed approach with the standard single blade. Being able to alternate between traditional single blade and Jarkai dual blade techniques is more appealing to me than having to master the saber staff, but that's just me. So, next question. Is there a dish or even a single food item from the Star Wars universe you'd like to try? This one might be a little bit obscure. There is a soup made by a blind Jedi Master called Zeo. This soup tastes either good or bad depending on whether the taster is at balance with the universe or the Force, rather. I don't know. I find that an interesting idea, and I think I'd like to try the Jedi's cooking. Next question. Your 5 favorite female Force users. If we're only talking about the characters themselves, and the fact that they happen to be Force sensitive, and not necessarily who I think are the most powerful female Force users, then I would say Mitra Surik, also known as the Jedi Exile, Bastila Shan, Shakti, Trasa, and Kreia. Now this is important. I don't actually like Kreia. but I think she's a fantastic character. Mitra Surik is one of my personal favorite Jedi of all time. I'll explain more on that later. Bastila Shan is one of the stars of my all-time favorite game, and I found her role in the story not only compelling, but the way that the romance between her and Revan, not just the way that the romance grew between them, but the reasons for why it happened, and how profoundly that relationship affects the wider galaxy in a very real sense. For it's not rhetoric or adherence to doctrine or a recital of the Jedi Code that saves Bastila Shan. It's her love for Revan, and in the end, that's what helps him bring her back from the brink and to turn the tide during the final battle. And I thought that was very gracefully handled and just profound. After that, Shakti. She's just one of my favorite characters. Shakti grew from being an obscure and rather unimportant Jedi Knight into a character whose death I was very sorry, almost insulted to have to be the one to deal the death blow. As a player of The Force Unleashed, I was sorry to have had a hand in the character's death. Trasa is just one of those Jedi whom I have a special appreciation for, in part because of her uniqueness, but also because of the way she was able to live her life. She found the right balance between maintaining the Jedi lifestyle as well as finding and holding on to love without ever falling to the dark side. Next question, and a related question. Okay, so the most attractive Jedi women, and in any sense of the word, I'll take this to mean character traits rather than their physicality, since most Jedi are in excellent shape anyway. Let's go with everyone I just mentioned minus Treya, and add on to that list Erin Lanier from the novel Deceived, the Dark Woman, also known as Anya Kuro, Master Faye, who's rather obscure probably, Satele Shan, Jaina Solo, Scout, and Nomi Sunrider. There are a number of reasons why I selected these characters, but they mostly stem from each of these characters' own inner strength as individuals. As an addendum, and on a much more superficial note, I would add on to that list Zool. There's just something about a Jedi with a cybernetic arm hefting an assault rifle that's just undeniable. Alright, next question. 10 places I would like to visit in Star Wars. Dantooine, Tatooine, Ossus, Munilist, Ilum, Telos 4, Ithor, Naboo, Coruscant, and Yavin 4. Next question. Would you say the Force is what sets the Star Wars universe apart from the other grand or epic universes? I'll answer this in a roundabout way. I'm going to seem like I'm going off on a tangent, but give me a minute. What I like about fictional settings, by and large, especially with long timelines, such as the Star Wars one, for instance, and events that continually impact the citizens of the setting over that long timeline, is the notion that things aren't really going to change all that much. It's what keeps the world interesting and allows me to revisit it with a certain amount of expectation, ironic though that seems, since things aren't changing that much. And one of my favorite lines is from the Disney movie, Peter Pan. All this has happened before, and it will all happen again. I'm no expert on Peter Pan lore, but what this seems to be to me, is a commentary on the stage of development when a person needs to let go of their childhood and look to the future. All of this has happened before, and it will all happen again. It happens to us. It's not a new story, but it's a relevant and resonant one. It means something to us all. We can all sympathize with this story. It's not new, it's not original, but it will mean something to us. And I like that line, and it was later lifted by the developer of Battlestar Galactica and entered into the scripture of those characters, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, I like stories that focus on the human condition, which by and large does not change all that often. Stories that incorporate love, desire, ego, jealousy, justice, and injustice, a question of why. Is it worth it? Am I worth it? Are we all worth it? I like stories that allow the character to discover whether or not they are worth saving, whether or not the world, as they know it, is one they'd like to continue in. And against these sorts of stories, the conflict is really the big backdrop. The drama lies in the existential questions, in the interactions, and the personal growth of the characters involved. It's not so much about the threat that they're facing. And what the Force provides is an outlet for writers to deal with within any timeline, or with any time period within the timeline, or any era, rather, within the mythos, and immediately have a point of reference. Because while any Force-sensitive can be guided by the Force, or hear the call of the dark side, it's ultimately their decision. If you were there, it's ultimately your decision. It is your choice to heed that call and embrace the darkness within, or to overcome that. To overcome it, that's what creates an instantly relatable situation, no matter what the actual point of the overall story is. And so that's what the Force allows the Star Wars mythos to be. That's how it allows the Star Wars mythos to be just as accessible no matter what era we're talking about. Without it, you sort of lose the sense of consequence. It is the Force that binds the citizens of the galaxy and allows me to understand what's going on, because the rules of the lore can't simply be overhauled every few years when the writing staff runs out of ideas. They have to deal within the confines of the lore's reality. And I think that's the reason why the Force sets the expanded universe apart from those of other franchises. I'm not sure that it's the be-all and end-all of the films themselves. Perhaps this is a question that requires an answer that's a little too involved for me to go into right now. But those are my basic thoughts on the matter. It's not necessarily what sets Star Wars apart, but it's what allowed it to be so accessible to me, and the reason why I was able to stick with it. So, next question. How do you feel about the future of Star Wars as a whole? I suppose cautiously optimistic would be how I would phrase it for now. I'm just waiting to see more material before I really give an actual opinion. I'd kind of be talking about nothing. Or things that haven't happened yet, rather, which effectively is the same thing. Next question. Do you think we'll see classic Star Wars games revisited or continually updated to be compatible with new computer tech? Well, I hope so. I think as long as there is a demand for such things, we'll have access to updated versions of the software to carry on with our ever-evolving hardware. Okay, next question. What are the most definitive or defining moments in your time as a Star Wars fan? Choose as many as you like. Okay, so most definitive moments as a Star Wars fan. Well, I'll keep it sort of simple. I was a kid in the 90s, and so the re-releases, when those hit theaters with the special edition changes, and I realized people have their strong opinions on the special edition changes, there was just this big fervor around Star Wars again. And everyone was hyped for this new sequel trilogy to come out later on. It was just an exciting time, and it was the first time I'd ever seen something like that, or with that kind of... it was the first time I'd ever seen something with that kind of a following in theaters. I'd only ever seen the films at home on VHS prior to that. And then The Phantom Menace came along, and I saw that on opening night with my much older cousin and her boyfriend. And it was the first and only Star Wars film that I ever got to see before my dad, and I remember calling him to tell him how much I liked it, because I was stupid, and I didn't realize how weak the film is. And then, of course, related to The Phantom Menace, there was actually a game for the PlayStation that came out that was called Jedi Power Battles, and it featured 5 playable characters, 3 of which were fairly well known at the time. Well, 1 of which was extremely well known, but 2 of which who were not. Because, you had Mace Windu, you had Qui-Gon Jinn, and you had Obi-Wan Kenobi. Now, everybody at least knows the name Kenobi. And Qui-Gon, of course, being one of the main characters in The Phantom Menace, was recognizable, and everybody knows who Sam Jackson is. So even though Mace Windu didn't do too much on screen at all, he was more recognizable. But the 2 other characters there were Plo Koon and Adi Gallia. Now, the game came with a booklet. This was very common at the time for video games or PlayStation games to come with manuals that were very detailed and oriented not just within the controls or tips for how to play the game well, but to tell you about the world you're playing in. And each of the characters had sort of a little mini biography in that booklet. And so these things, they provided details of not only the characters' movesets, but of their lives and their personalities. And that was the first time I found myself really wanting to know more about the Jedi Order, or about the Jedi Order before the rise of the Empire, rather. And then, of course, I discovered the visual dictionaries, and the novels and the video games and things just sort of took off from there. So those 3 things were probably the absolute earliest memories I have regarding what sparked my interest in Star Wars as a whole. I'd always liked the films. I'd watched the films at home on VHS, of course, so I liked Star Wars, but actually getting in to the wider universe of Star Wars, getting into the expanded universe and all that mythos, that was actually sparked by those 3 things initially, I suppose. Especially getting to see the films on the big screen, and that's what made it so very memorable to me, and such an indelible sort of mark on my childhood. And so that's what did it for me. Next question: who do you think were the greatest, in a holistic sense, Jedi of all time? You may choose as many as you like, but try not to go past 10. I'm not going to choose that many. I'm going to keep this rather brief. Understand that this is just my opinion. I'm not saying that this is a definitive list, and I understand if anybody would completely disagree with this for any number of reasons. That's fine. But for me, I'm only going to list 3. These are not the most powerful Jedi. These are not my favorite all-time Star Wars characters. They are not necessarily the most iconic. They are not even 2 of which, I suppose, are not even the most relevant, especially not in a pop culture sense. But they are the 3 I think of immediately and almost involuntarily when I hear the word Jedi. And they are Jolee Bindo, Mitra Surik, or the Jedi Exile, and Obi-Wan Kenobi. Jolie's wisdom was born not of some grand understanding of the Force, or some adherence to doctrine or rhetoric, or even out of lessons from the past and mistakes made by, phantoms and spirits or whatever. He was speaking from personal experience. And so the warnings he gave, the commentary he had on subjects such as love, on how the Jedi Order had failed him, the failings of the Order, but also their good intentions. His words just carried that much more weight because you knew he was speaking from a place of sympathy and not from authority. Mitra Surik is the quintessential Jedi, in my opinion. And one who, while not the most powerful, left an indelible, truly indelible legacy upon not just the galaxy, but the Jedi Order specifically. She walked back into a galaxy that was just in tatters. It had been ripped to shreds and left with the Order in the stages of being rebuilt. She left it in that state. She walked into a mess, and she left with the Order having the tools that it needed. She gave the Order the tools that it needed to rebuild, with a strong foundation from which to learn, and then she went to join her former commander and friend, Revan, following him unwaveringly into the unknown regions. She may not have the biggest fan base, and she's certainly not the most powerful Jedi, and she's not even my favorite character. I don't necessarily like her more than a figure like Revan per se, but I do have a greater amount of respect for her. Like so many others before her, she made her fair share of mistakes. She's not perfect, but she is worthy of all of our respect, in my opinion. And Obi-Wan Kenobi, he just represents what any Jedi should strive to be, if you ask me. If you take away Kenobi's skill, his power, and his authority, if you discount his experience or his accomplishments, his survival of physical death, despite all of that kind of stuff, just taking it to a very basic level, and even taking into account the mistakes that he did make along the way, what you'd be left with is a resolutely and irrefutably good person. And that's what really counts. So those three make up my ideal for what the Jedi stand for. For the way that they handled adversity throughout the distinct ways it manifested within each of their lives, for their strength in the Force, and as individuals, and their use of the Force to better not their own lives, but the lives of those around them, for their ability to carry on in the face of their own past failures, and for simply being who they were. Those are my three Jedi role models. Okay, next question. Do you think the Mandalorian Wars were a mistake, or was it a monumental, tragic catch-22 with no real definitively right or wrong answer? I'm assuming that this pertains to, or primarily pertains to the question of whether or not the Jedi Order, the Jedi as individuals, should have involved themselves in the conflict. I don't think either Revan and Malak and their forces, nor the Jedi Council handled the situation completely, 100%, the correct way or appropriately. But there can be no question in my mind that the Jedi needed to act in some manner. This line of thought could get into a rather large amount of hypothetical speculation and questioning, but at the end of the day, no, it was not a mistake for the Jedi to get involved. The consequences, though unfortunate, were not necessarily completely unavoidable from the outset. Alright, next question. Which two areas of the Force would you like to specialize in? Alright, so for those of you who don't know, Force powers fall into three distinct branches of abilities. And this is all much more involved than I'm going to get into now. But for now, the three branches are as follows. Control, Sense, and Alter. Now, Control and the abilities that fall under that branch, those focus on a Jedi's mastery of discipline. Control affords them skills like their enhanced reflexes, their incredible speed, their ability to promote self-healing or detoxify the body of poisons. It's also what governs a Force user's ability to use the Force for stealth, and even to transcend the physical plane as a Force ghost or spirit, among other things. Sense, of course, is the second branch. It deals in powers of perception, such as precognition, telepathy, Force visions, the ability to interpret shatter points, that kind of stuff. Alter is the third branch, and it's often associated with Sith, but no less present amongst the Jedi teachings. This is the branch that allows a Force wielder to influence the world around them. Abilities range from common telekinesis to Taminis, to ensnaring and manipulating the minds of targets, to Force lightning, among many, many other such abilities. Now, to some extent, everyone with notable Force sensitivity, that is to say, anybody who would be able to become a Jedi or a Sith or something of that nature, is gifted with some ability within each of these three branches. That said, if I could only choose to specialize in two of the branches, I would choose both control and alter. If I had the Force, I would be using my abilities to affect change and to protect, to a greater extent than I would be cloistering myself in a tower and pondering the mysteries of the universe. While the sense talents are by no means unimportant, they aren't as appealing to me as the other two groups. So, next question. Okay. This one's fairly long, so give me a moment. Do you think the Jedi, as an order, would be better off if they distanced themselves somewhat from whichever regime currently governs most of the galaxy? The question goes on. At times, it seems as if tying themselves too closely to the Republic has often hampered and even cost them dearly, and despite their many great sacrifices and achievements, they're often rewarded with scorn or persecuted when convenient for politicians and an often ignorant galactic populace. Or is this just a case of the right thing to do is not necessarily the easy thing to do? In effect, is this part of the Jedi's noble sacrifice in service to the greater good? Alright, well, much like my answer to the question of the Mandalorian Wars and whether or not the Jedi should have been involved, or should have gotten themselves involved, rather, I do think that it would be, frankly, irresponsible for the Jedi to distance themselves too much from the governing bodies of the galaxy. And I mean that both from the standpoint that it would be bad for the citizens of the galaxy as a whole, and it would also be bad for the members of the Jedi Order. I'll explain this. The fact is that distancing themselves too far from the galaxy, it would be irresponsible because doing so would limit the Order's degree of agency. The Order's ability to use the Force gives them a great deal of power. This is not up for debate. And this power comes by the Jedi Order's members naturally. They're born with it. And I think that kind of power, if you don't corral it somehow, if you don't give it an occupation, if you don't give service to it, if you don't give it a purpose, you'll get into very serious trouble. Power without a purpose, I think, can corrupt more quickly than power of any other sort. No matter what, a Jedi is going to have a difficult life. There's no getting around that. But if they distance themselves too much from the events of the wider galaxy, and particularly of galactic politics, then, regardless of whether or not they go unappreciated by the masses, their absence could only breed further corruption, both within the Order and without. I'm not saying the Jedi are perfect, far from it. But they would do even more damage by turning a blind eye than by getting involved. What I do disagree with, though, is the placement of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. I understand the need for a base of operations, I do. Especially one so close to the heart of galactic politics. But I think that the Jedi Order should attempt to remain somewhat, though not entirely, detached from the mundane world. Now, this doesn't mean they should be aloof. No, that's not what I'm saying. I think they should be somewhat nomadic by nature, going where and when the Force advises them, so that they may be wherever they are most needed. They should not wait to be called upon by politicians before helping those in need. This is another aspect of the Knights of the Old Republic games that appealed to me so much. The idea that of there being an outpost or an enclave where common settlers and farmers could appeal for aid from the powerful Jedi Masters that lived on their outskirts, rather than having to go through the bureaucratic chains of command to get an audience with the Council. It just seemed so much more appropriate to me and true to the Jedi ideal. So, in general, I think the Jedi should be more spread out. I think they should try to concern themselves less with politics, but I do not think that they should be removed from it. Or rather, to be removed from them. So, I realized that was a fairly complex answer, but it was a complex question. Speaking of which, we have another complex question. I'm going to truncate this. What do you think of ideas like the Jedi being able to heal devastated worlds that would be unsalvageable or take centuries to recover using purely technological or conventional means, curing virulent pandemics not treatable by existing medical technology, preventing natural disasters, pacifying large populations with their spoken and force influence to better sell the idea that such a tiny group can make such a massive difference to the galaxy at large outside of war, not to mention balance how the Sith manage more diabolical feats on massive scales. Okay. Um, I think it would depend entirely on the situation. One of the things that I think is sometimes misunderstood about the Jedi Order as a whole, not just by fans of the franchise, but of the citizens who swell the galactic ranks, the citizens who actually live in universe. One of the common misconceptions regards the notion of Jedi non-attachment and that whole ideal. And I realize that to some extent, the Jedi are guilty of taking this to an extreme, and so are therefore worthy of the criticism that they garner. But it's not as simple as that. It's not that the Jedi do not care about the world around them. It's that they strive not to allow their attachments to drag them into despair when something becomes lost to them. Okay? And of course, that idea can be taken to a dangerous extreme, an irresponsible extreme, and a downright unlikable one. But the ideal, the goal in and of itself, I think, makes perfect sense. Now, with that notion comes the idea that beings, as well as worlds and creatures, etc., all have their time. And a Jedi, I think, would not and perhaps should not devote themselves to attempting to bring something that is lost back from the brink. However, the idea of them gathering in sizable numbers to prevent natural disasters, to cure virulent plagues and such, things that can be treated, this is something I would gladly support. Pacifying large crowds with the Force, or with their Force influence, is kind of a sketchy idea. I don't think that they should attempt to permanently alter somebody else's perception of reality. They shouldn't make somebody feel good if their circumstances are genuinely shitty. That just seems like just such a wretched idea to me. It would be acceptable in the short term only for me. For example, if they were attempting to prevent an outbreak of violence and mayhem at a riot or something. The ability of the Jedi to forcibly persuade others is one of the most well-known abilities, is one of their most well-known abilities, rather, and one that is understandably, or can understandably provoke mistrust in the minds of normal individuals. So they would have to exercise great caution. But yes, I would like to see more potent demonstrations from the light to counterbalance the devastation so commonly attributed to darkness, and so casually attributed to darkness. Next question. Which is your favorite depiction of the Force? I'm not entirely sure what the context is here. If we're talking about what it looks like in a combative sense, how it can be used to fight and protect oneself, then the way it's used in the Old Republic trailers is the most appealing to me. If we're talking about what the Force is, what creates it, the ideas behind it, I prefer the descriptions given by figures like Yoda and Obi-Wan in the original films. Next question. The dark side of the Force, is it a natural and even necessary part of the Force, or an unavoidable infection that has to be contained and eradicated as much as possible? So this is an opinionated question, or it requires an opinionated answer, rather. For me, I say it's necessary, absolutely necessary, both from an in-universe standpoint and out. meaning from a storytelling perspective, the presence of a dark side is what gives a story focused on a Jedi the presence of pervasive and unavoidable danger. It is an obstacle that they will never fully and completely overcome just by the nature of being human or humanoid, of being sentient, rather. To opt for a story without the presence of darkness would be to opt for a story without stakes. I have no interest in that. Beyond that, from a lore perspective, it's more important to me that the individual's choices inform how dark or light they are, rather than the abilities they choose to use. Sure, a Jedi should strive to keep the darkness at bay, since it's hinted very often and consistently that the dark side has a will of its own, much like the Force as a whole. But I also think that the Force's natural state ought to allow for the presence of both darkness and light. Next question. Okay, so Bastila Shan versus Satele Shan. This could be a very long and drawn out thought process or line of thought, but at the end of the day, my reasoning would be based on the following fact. Facts rather. Satele has both the blood of Bastila and Revan, and has a greater amount of accolades attributed to her in addition to being a Grand Master of the Jedi Order. Though Bastila is a far more interesting character to me, by a considerable margin, I'm inclined to think that Satele is the more capable combatant in an overall sense, so my vote goes for Satele. Moving on. Greater expansion on the idea of Jedi and Sith technology. I'm not really sure how to answer this, meaning I'm not sure exactly what the question pertains to. I'm not really interested in technology as a whole in the Star Wars universe. All I can really tell you on this, or the only way I can really explain this, is that Star Wars is very much fantasy set in space. It's not true science fiction. I don't really care too much about how the technology works, to be completely honest with you. I'm not averse to the idea of others exploring the topic, but it's not one that I'm especially enthusiastic or knowledgeable about, so I can't really comment too much here. Sorry. Next question. What is the most frustrating part about being a Star Wars fan? There's a number of different ways that this question could be approached or answered. Star Wars is such an all-encompassing and expansive franchise. I think anytime you have an audience as enormous and accordingly as divisive, you're going to be forced into contact with fans who have completely different points of view. Sometimes this is irritating, sometimes it's enlightening. The point is, nothing that is produced with the Star Wars name can possibly please us all. So the sheer act of voicing an opinion can invite floods of criticism, and to me that's probably the most frustrating thing. For me anyway, but I'm sure that others would have a different, or share a different opinion on the matter, which just goes to prove my point. Next question. Do you hope they use Jason Solo, Tenel Ka, Lobaka, Kip Duran, and Corran Horn in the new Episode 7 movie? Okay. The next couple of questions pertain to Episode 7. If Episode 7 destroys the Star Wars timeline, will you still be a fan? Blah, blah, blah. Look, let's see. I don't really feel one way or the other about all of that. I have no real strong emotional connection to the EU in the post-Return of the Jedi era. I've just never been particularly interested in it, and I found a lot of the stories that take place in that time either unsatisfactory, poorly written, or they just didn't grip me the way that stories from the Clone Wars era and before did. That said, I understand other fans' appreciation for it, and I don't want to take away from that. But to answer the question of if Episode 7 destroys the Star Wars timeline, will I still be a fan of Star Wars as a whole? Certainly. Of the film itself, potentially. I mean, it really depends on what they do. If I had it my way, Episode 7 would have nothing to do with anything that we've seen before. I wish they would do something entirely new and unexpected, so all I can really do now is sit and wait. So I can't comment too much on this. Next question. Every fanboy wants to know your opinion on Darth Sidious versus Luke Skywalker. Who wins, Luke or Palp? At his peak, Luke Skywalker. No debate. Next question. What is your favorite Star Wars era? My primary fascination would be from the Tales of the Jedi up through the Rise of the Empire era. That's a very long time. Several thousand years. If I had to pick a single favorite era, I suppose it would be the Clone Wars as a whole. But only because the vast majority of my favorite novels and comics take place around that time. So, there you are. Next question. What was the first expanded universe novel that you read? I'll answer this in two ways. The first Star Wars book that I ever read that was aimed at children was Star Wars Jedi Apprentice number 7, The Captive Temple. The first adult-oriented Star Wars novel that I read all the way through was Star Wars Darth Maul Shadowhunter. Next question. Okay, this is a two-part. Next question. What did you think of the Clone Wars TV show, and are you looking forward to Star Wars Rebels? I've made no secret of my personal dissatisfaction or dislike of the latest Clone Wars series. Having said that, to cast it in a more positive light here, and to speak honestly and not as somebody who's trying to change my opinion in the 11th hour, because I'm not. While the Clone Wars was definitely better than the majority of what's on Cartoon Network today, it was not a show I enjoyed consistently. Mostly because it retconned a number of things that I had enjoyed from the Dark Horse comics, specifically Star Wars Republic, and that entire iteration of the Clone Wars, from about 10 years ago. And the show definitely got better as time went on in a technical sense, and even in terms of the writing in some areas. But the first two seasons really were pretty ridiculous from where I'm standing, and the movie was god-awful. But if I set my personal bias aside, I think it was a decently produced show. But as it stands, because of my own personal feelings, I just so much, I enjoyed the novels and comics and microseries a great deal more. The second part of the question was whether or not I'm looking forward to the new show, Star Wars Rebels. I don't know how much originality they're going to bring to the table with this. So again, I don't want to come to it with a pessimistic attitude before it even gets a chance, but I just can't really comment on it. I don't feel a great amount of anticipation, but that could change after I see some actual content. So we'll see. Next question. Besides Knights of the Old Republic, what is some of your favorite expanded universe material? Games, comics, novels, etc. Well, the Darth Bane trilogy of novels, the Labyrinth of Evil novel, the Revenge of the Sith novel, Shatterpoint, the novel, Yoda Dark Rendezvous, the novel, the original Dark Horse Republic comics or Clone Wars comics, comic volumes, Star Wars Tales, as well as Tales of the Jedi, the Stark Hyperspace War, Jedi Council Acts of War, Dark Lord Rise of Darth Vader, and certain elements from Crimson Empire and the Legacy era comics. I enjoy a number of ideas surrounding the Legacy of the Force books, but I'm not a fan of Karen Travis's work, by and large. And I know that she's only one of the authors that dealt there, but a lot of my dissatisfaction comes from her involvement. Dark Empire is pretty well written in my view, but I just think that at the end of the day, it really invalidates a lot of the spirit surrounding Darth Vader's sacrifice. It just kind of cheapens it. I also really liked the Jedi Knight games and the Battlefront series, so there you go. Next question. This is not a question. Okay, so somebody's like, I love it when you guys collaborate, meaning myself and Connor from Gensarai. You're both incredibly talented, thank you. And I love your view on Star Wars. You and Gensarai should record an informal Star Wars discussion, maybe take audience questions. I will ask him about that. Okay, a question about the rumor of the movie of the next Star Wars Episode 7 to be pushed back to 2016, and what do I think about that? I'm willing to wait as long as possible, or as long as necessary, for a quality product. Alright, moving on. Okay, so the next few questions are all regarding Episode 7. There's a YouTube user whose channel is really taking off the last few months, named Evan Nova, and he made a video called Top 10 Possible Star Wars Episode 7 Plot Lines or something like that. What he has to say toward the end of that video pretty much sums up how I feel at the moment, so I would advise you to search that out. I can't really add anything to that discussion that he hasn't said already. So, moving on. With Disney Disney/Lucasfilm making an exclusive deal with EA, and to that extent BioWare, what would be some of the Star Wars related games you would like to see? I just want another good Star Wars RPG. Can we get Star Wars Skyrim style, except with a much better story and more meaningful interactions with your NPCs? Next question. Since the Jedi Knight storyline is in Star Wars The Old Republic was supposed to be Knights of the Old Republic 3's storyline before it became an MMO, are you satisfied with that? And if not, what would you have done differently? I'd be here all day explaining what I would do differently. I'll just tell you I was not satisfied. The entire end of the story just felt like a waste of potential and like a failed setup for a continuation that never happened. Star Wars The Old Republic could have been great. To its credit, I thought it was decent, even now. I certainly had fun with it, but the original KOTOR duology was about so much more than fun. And this really missed the mark. Of course, I would have preferred a straight Knights of the Old Republic 3. I think we all would. I was willing to follow this story to the end, but unfortunately, the end failed to impress. It hardly qualifies as an end at all to this sort of storyline. Sotil Shan, Darth Malgus, the Sith Emperor himself, basically, the characters that made up the entire, marketing or an advertisement effort and the lead up to the game. None of these characters were really executed brilliantly in the game, though I did enjoy their presence in the various novels they appear in. Ultimately, the story just didn't hit the mark, and all of the characters will abruptly just sort of fade into obscurity, as far as I can tell anyway. Definitely not what I would have wanted to have seen happen. But superficial as it may seem, I'm glad that the game was released, mostly because I enjoyed the trailer so much. And the game, as I said, it's decent. I had fun with it. I like certain elements of the story. But overall, it just didn't seem like the climax that we'd all waited so long for. Not by any stretch of the imagination. Moving on. Okay. Do you consider Mace Windu a Grey Jedi? No, I do not. And that's Grey Jedi, not Great Jedi. I do not consider Mace Windu to be a Grey Jedi. Windu is an elite master whose abilities extend into a number of unusual areas, and he's not afraid to ride the line. He doesn't act rashly, so to speak, but he does do whatever he feels is necessary. For Unfortunately, he doesn't usually allow his abilities to run away with him. He's able to keep himself in check. And that's one of the reasons, or that's a product of his being exceptional among the Order. The fact that he can use his darker impulses to further the goals of the light. As one of the leaders of the Jedi Council, I think he is very much in step with the traditions upheld by the Order, and so not a gray Jedi at all. He doesn't attempt to distance himself from or divorce the Order in any way. He doesn't necessarily try to walk his own unique road or to live apart from the Council. He's, as previously stated, exceptionally skilled and very direct. I think that if he had been in charge, the Jedi might actually have prevailed. I have a reason for this. There's a chapter called Masters, I believe, in the Revenge of the Sith novel. And it paints a very clear picture of how Windu would have liked to have operated with regard to the revelation that there was a Sith involved with the Senate. And how he disagreed with how Mace Windu disagreed with Yoda's approach to the or with Yoda's handling of the situation given that knowledge. And neither were truly wrong with their approach. This is all something that becomes clear in retrospect. Yoda's hesitance to move against the Senate is one of the reasons why Sidious managed to conceal himself so effectively. He essentially wasn't challenged. So as I say, I think there are areas in which Windu's leadership would have benefited the Order more so than Yoda's. And by Yoda's own admission, he did allow the Order to stagnate. And to a certain degree, despite his ability to see the future, ended up being somewhat short-sighted. But again, this is something that's clear in retrospect, as is so often the case. So I'm not saying that Windu's a better Jedi than Yoda's. It's just, in an ironic sense, the course of action he proposed might have damaged the Order's reputation, but it could have very well ended up saving it. But I do not consider Mace Windu to be a gray Jedi. His moment of crisis is covered in his novel, in the novel Shatterpoint. That's by far the most difficult thing he ever had to, or most difficult time he ever had to. The most difficult time in his life, the most painful experience he had to endure, was his mission to his homeworld, Harun Kal, during that novel. But by the end of that book, he's very much proud of his life as a Jedi and as confident as ever. And so, no, I do not consider him to be a gray Jedi. Would you rather be a Jedi from the Old Republic or the New Republic? Old Republic. It's just such a much more fascinating time, and I have a bias towards it just because of my nostalgia and enjoyment of the Old Republic video games. And it just seems like a much more... the galaxy just seems not bigger, but just a bit more unknown. And I like that. It just seems like there's more to learn and discover. Which planet would you like to be born on? Oh, I don't know. That's kind of interesting. I've never really thought of it like that before. The question is normally, where would you like to visit? I think with a galaxy as rich as the one depicted in Star Wars, I'd like to be born on a world where my kind would be somewhat uncommon, or perhaps even decidedly uncommon, as a means of getting to better understand the other cultures in the galaxy. So maybe somewhere like Kashyyyk or Glian Selm or something like that. The next question. What is your opinion on Master Vrook? Vrook was a man who tested my patience at every turn, to no end, without fail. Having said that, I enjoy his presence in the game. I love Ed Asner's body of work as an actor, and voice actor in particular. This guy was Granny Goodness from Superman and Hudson from Gargoyles, after all. I think Vrook was a powerful and commanding master, and to a certain degree I respect him, but he's also kind of an asshole. So, there you go. Okay. Who is your favorite Star Wars character? I don't have one favorite character. I just don't. Overwhelmingly, I find Force sensitives to be the most interesting group of individuals as a whole, but I have dozens of favorite characters ranging from Jedi to Sith to smugglers to bounty hunters. I couldn't pick just one, and that's part of the reason why Star Wars is so great to me. Next question. What Star Wars related thing is your guilty pleasure? I suppose the prequel trilogy themselves count. I seriously cannot defend them as films. There are innumerable problems with them, but I have an attachment to the overall story, because as it turned out, with help from authors like James Luceno and Matthew Stover, who really fleshed out the politics, the motivations of the characters, the emotions that were swirling around the situation, and really made the readers want to invest in what was going on. And those are only a couple of the authors. There are several who were absolutely invaluable here. But the story of the fall of the Jedi Order and the rise of the Empire, it's a satisfying and tragic tale that was pulled off well overall with the help of other authors outside of Lucas's own work. Yeah. Next question. What Star Wars character do you think has the absolute worst fans? It's difficult to say. I like a number of different characters, such as Darth Bane, Mace Windu, Revan, and Yoda, just to name a few. And each of these figures, for example, has have very level-headed groups of fans, and each have fans who get completely carried away. Or each has a specific kind of fan who just gets carried away with their support and these people just sort of abandon rational thought along the way, and I would hesitate to say a single character has the overall worst fan base, but it's a definite issue. I can say with certainty that while Revan is one of my personal favorite characters, as well as the centerpiece of one of my favorite overall concepts or stories as a whole, and certainly my favorite within the Star Wars mythos, some of his fans give the rest of us a bad name, for example. But Kreia, Sidious, Windu, Dooku, Yoda, even Darth Vader, each of these characters, any character without much charisma or a following, is going to have their fair share of ridiculous fans. So there's no way I could give just one character that dubious honor of having the worst fans. Okay, moving on. Alright, if you could do a complete design overhaul, just the appearance, not the personality, of one character from the movies, who would it be, what would you change, and why? This might be a slightly disappointing answer because it's not going to be a big deal to anybody but me, and it's not going to be about a character that anybody is going to really remember all that well, and certainly they're not going to remember this person fondly. It's just something that's always bothered me. This has to do with an extremely minor character whose physiology, the character's name is Coleman Trebor, and he's one of the Jedi Council members in Attack of the Clones. This guy has 360-degree range of vision, okay? And he still managed to be taken out by a simple shot to the gut from Jango Fett. I don't know. That's just always seemed especially stupid to me. So I would redesign his character on that basis alone. I get that this is like really complaining about minutia. I know it's not a big deal, but it just seems so just pointless to me that the Jedi with 360-degree range of vision and enhanced reflexes is ultimately no better equipped to deal with a marksman than somebody like Han Solo. Okay, next question. Okay, so I have a string of quick versus proposals here. Darth Plagueis versus Darth Zana. Look, from where I'm sitting, either Bane or Zana could have won their final battle. A combination of good fortune and having kept an aspect of her Sith sorcery in reserve is what allowed Zana to take her master by surprise, since he had bested her in traditional combat. And even there, if she'd If she if she'd had even slightly less willpower than she did, he'd have been able to take over her body through essence transfer. So I don't think, a lot of people view her defeat of Bane as being that simple. She defeated him outright. I don't think it's that simple at all. I don't think she's a more viable Sith Lord than him just because she emerged victorious. I think it's unlikely that Xana can use her tendrils at the drop of a hat when in a location that is not steeped so heavily in the dark side the way Ambria is. Thus, on fair terms, I would consider her to be far and away Plagueis' inferior. Darth Plagueis' skill with the Force, while broader in focus, is no less potent for that fact. I just think he would annihilate Xana 9 times out of 10, in my opinion. Only some fluke would save her. Saro Zaj versus Darth Maul. While I don't see any reason to assume that Saro Zaj is at a severe disadvantage as a lightsaber duelist, I think that in an overall sense, Maul is the more capable Force wielder, and that combined with his swordsmanship, which would be, at worst, a match for Saro Zaj's own, he'd be tipped for the win. Luke Skywalker and Jolee Bindo versus Exar Kun and Darth Sion. Any team that includes Luke is pretty much imbalanced from the start. I'm going to give Luke at his peak the edge on his own. Factor in Jolee, and it's really not much of a contest at all. So the Jedi take this one. Yoda versus Darth Traya. This is similar to Xana versus Plagueis. Traya has a trump card to play with her Force Drain ability. I don't like how certain powers seem to be without a defensive tactic. But having said that, I'm just not sure how well she'd fare against Yoda to begin with. In fair combat, and without warning of his arrival, I'm certain he'd be able to overwhelm her quite handily. As a traditional Force wielder and lightsaber duelist, I'd give Yoda the edge any day. But if by some fluke he'd be vulnerable to Traya's infamous tactic, then, who knows? But I give Yoda the tentative nod. And lastly, Palpatine Dark Empire versus Darth Bane Dynasty of Evil. I think Darth Bane stands a perfectly good chance against Palpatine in Revenge of the Sith. But the portrayal of the character in Dark Empire, though, by that time things are drastically different. I'll say Palpatine, much as I prefer Bane as a character. Or individual, rather. If you were a Jedi, what class would you be? Meaning Guardian, Consular, or Sentinel? Or would you choose your own unique Jedi path? While I would undoubtedly try to forge my own unique path in an overall sense, the Sentinel is the most appealing of the Jedi classes to me. Okay. Next question. If you could make your own original Star Wars narrative, what would it be about, and what time period would it take place in? In the Darth Plagueis novel, an allusion is made to a Sith Lord who lived 500 years after the time of Darth Bane, and therefore approximately 500 years prior to the rise of Emperor Palpatine. And there was a Sith Lord who sabotaged the Sith teachings after being swayed over to the light side. His name was Darth Gravid. His apprentice, Darth Gion, stepped in and assumed command of the Sith Order after dealing with her master. The story does not go into any great detail, but this is an interesting idea, and one I would like to either read or write, I think, because so often we hear about people being swayed or seduced by the dark side, but for a Dark Lord of the Sith, no less, to be conscripted over to the light, or to be tempted to incorporate light side teachings into Sith doctrine, it's a fascinating notion, and I'd like to explore that quite a bit. I hope that somebody does. Next question. If you were Force sensitive but could only learn one Force ability / power, which would it be? Alright, so this question is a little too hypothetical for me to give a straight answer to. There is no such thing as a Force sensitive who can only use one power. It doesn't reflect how the Force actually works, this question. And more often than not, it is the relationship between the abilities that make them valuable. What good is battle mind, for example, if I do not have the ability to augment my physical abilities? But as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 branches of force powers. I already mentioned which 2 I would specialize in if given that choice. But if I could truly only learn to use one branch, I think it would be control. It would allow me to move and process information far more quickly than other humans, and it would afford me healing abilities among other things. And even survive death. So if I really had to opt for the bare minimum of what the Force can impart, I'd go for the qualities that make me difficult to track, difficult to outmaneuver, and difficult to harm ahead of anything else. I'd rather be effectively superhuman than capable of seeing the future or transmuting energy. Next question. If you could remove one thing from the Star Wars lore, what would it be? The example that they give in the question is midichlorians. Well, I am more partial to... I was definitely more partial to the Force prior to the revelation about midichlorians. But the way that they are worked into other stories like Darth Plagueis, I mean, I can accept them, even if the notion of people simply being born with a greater genetic disposition or propensity for the Force just seems kind of at odds with the way it was originally portrayed to me. Having said that, there really isn't actually much I would like to erase entirely, so to speak. There are just a lot of things I think could be heavily improved upon. In most cases, I'd only like to replace something, or to remove something and replace it with something else, not erase it entirely. I'd only erase the Old Republic, for example, if I could replace it with my own version of the story. I wouldn't want to just get rid of it. You see what I'm saying? And I wouldn't want to simply remove the Old Republic simply because I like the things that or I like some of the things that have come or been brought about through it. So, like the trailers, certain novels, certain characters, etc. Nor would I want to simply remove the Phantom Menace without being able to replace it with my version of the story. You see what I mean? Now, having said that, there is one particular character whose creation just seems totally and utterly pointless to me, and that is the figure of Thame Cerulean, who was Dooku's master after his initial instruction with Yoda. I don't know what they were smoking when they came up with this character, or whose idea this was, but it's just fucking stupid. So I would erase Thame Cerulean from the mythos entirely. There are plenty of other characters I don't like. There are plenty of other characters like Ahsoka, who I have a personal bias against for my own reasons, but none that I would really want to just completely destroy so much as Thame Cerulean. So he'd be my pick. Okay, next question. Have you watched the Red Letter Media or Harry Plinkett Star Wars film reviews? If so, what did you think of them? Yes, I have. I had quite a lot of fun with those, or at least the first and the third. His Attack of the Clones review wasn't as good to me. His Phantom Menace series is by far the most entertaining to me personally, and I really can't argue with any point that he brings up within the course of that review. Not that I would really want to. I am as much a detractor of those films as anyone else. As I said, the only redeeming qualities to that overall story are the entries from the expanded universe. I'm not a big fan of the prequel trilogy as films by any stretch of the imagination. I like a lot of the work that's been crafted around them. The films themselves, though, I think are subpar, to put it kindly. Okay, next question. In your opinion... Okay, let's see. Okay, so this has to do with the question of Force or Sith lightning. This is a concept that was introduced in the Darth Plagueis novel. In your opinion, is electric judgment or emerald lightning weaker than that of Sith lightning because the Sith have altered DNA? According to Darth Plagueis, Sith lightning is not stronger simply because a user has altered himself by him or herself by becoming the victim of a lightning attack or by being struck by it. According to from the way he described it, Sith lightning is supposed to be stronger from the outset, simply by its nature. Mainly because it is uninhibited, or the user of Sith lightning is uninhibited by compassion, which is at odds with the Jedi Knight's philosophy. He goes on to say that rather than showing reverence for the Force, a Sith must treat it as a beast of burden, if I remember correctly, to bend the Force to the Sith Lord's own will. This would be reason enough for me to presume that Sith lightning is stronger or carries a more destructive potential than the form utilized by Jedi. And he does mention that becoming the victim of a lightning attack is necessary to summon it properly, but why one should need to be on the receiving end of the lightning in order to take the energy in, I can't say. To be honest with you, I think that this is an outgrowth of Lucino's sentiment, or his usual style. It just seems like a reference to what ultimately happened to Palpatine from Revenge of the Sith. I mean, reading the Darth Plagueis novel, it's like Lucino had a copy of the movie scripts in his hand. I mean, he's writing these retroactively, so he knows what's going to happen. And he's always liked to make references to events past, present, and future. Not just stuff that's running concurrent to the material he's talking about or long before, but stuff that he knows is ultimately going to happen later down the road. I wouldn't think too hard on that specific point. I would say that Sith lightning is stronger, but I'm dubious as to exactly why being shocked by it should make one stronger. I just find that kind of random. I think it's much more important to note that Sith lightning is brought to bear by users who feel no compassion for the target, and thus it just seems like it would be more inherently destructive. Okay. Only 2 more questions. Alright, so is Star Wars your favorite fictional universe? If so, what makes it okay, that's a little confused. What makes you prefer it over others? It is my favorite fictional universe overall. I can't fully articulate why that is, though. I think the point I made earlier about the Force making the EUs that much more accessible to me is a big part of why that is. I also like the dynamic of the way the Force works, the way the lightsaber fighting forms were developed, and the reasons why, and the fact that the timeline is as expansive as it is. There's just so much more information out there to get your hands on, so much more to explore, so much yet to be explained. It's an easy world to lose yourself in, and when you look at how expansive the galaxy of Star Wars, of the Star Wars mythos is, it's just one big giant frontier, and getting to explore it, whether through a video game, a novel, or a film, is just the most sublime sort of escapism. It's just one big giant frontier, and in the end, I think that element, that quality, that sense of freedom is what sets Star Wars apart. For me. Alright, so this is the last question. If you had to be one sentient species from the Star Wars universe apart from human, what would it be? I think I would choose to be a Neti. They are shape-shifting sentient plants who can mimic the appearance of humanoids, and they have extremely long lifespans. We're talking thousands of years. I don't need to be a true immortal, but to have that sort of lifespan, what a gift that would be in an environment, again, as expansive and free as Star Wars' own. You could see so very much, and that just seems like such a profound, just such a wonderful experience to be blessed with. So that would be my choice. Okay, well, thank you for joining me on my exceedingly long question and answer video. Thank you all so much for participating and submitting your questions. Maybe we'll all do this again sometime. Maybe I'll do another one every year, make an annual tradition out of it. Thanks again. I enjoyed it. I had fun. I hope you all did, and I'll talk to you later. Happy holidays, guys.